The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Roman Root tightened his tie in the mirror, his police badge gleaming under the bathroom light. Alma stood behind him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She forced a smile as he turned to kiss her goodbye, his lips brushing hers with the familiarity of 9 years of marriage. "Be safe," she murmured, her voice steady but her eyes distant. Roman nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Alma watched from the window as Roman's patrol car disappeared down the street. She exhaled deeply, her shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She glanced at the clock, 7:15 p.m. Her heart quickened. In 15 minutes, the girls would be asleep, and she would be free. Free to step into the shadows of her double life. Upstairs, their 2 daughters, Mia and Lily, giggled over a bedtime story. Alma climbed the stairs, her steps heavy with guilt but her resolve unshaken. She kissed their foreheads, her mind already wandering to the man who waited just a few houses down. "Good night, my loves," she whispered, her voice trembling ever so slightly. As the house fell into silence, Alma slipped into a loose sweater and stepped out into the cool evening air. The neighbor's porch light flickered, a signal she had come to recognize. Her heart pounded as she walked a familiar path, each step a betrayal she had long since justified. Daniel's house was a sanctuary of soft lighting and quiet elegance, a stark contrast to the chaos of Alma's own home. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of his cologne, creating an atmosphere that felt both comforting and intoxicating. Alma sat on the edge of his leather couch, her hands clasped tightly around the glass of wine he had handed her. She took a sip, the bitterness of the drink mirroring the turmoil in her heart. Daniel sat beside her, his presence warm and inviting. He was everything Roman wasn't: attentive, available, and unafraid to express his feelings. "You look tired," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. "Are you okay?" Alma hesitated, her defenses wavering under his gaze. "It's just hard sometimes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Roman's always gone, and the girls, they're wonderful, but it's a lot." Daniel nodded, his expression sympathetic. "You're carrying so much on your own. You deserve someone who sees you, who appreciates you." His words struck a chord, and Alma felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent years burying her needs, her desires, beneath the weight of her responsibilities. But here, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel seen. As the evening wore on, their conversation grew more intimate. Daniel spoke of his own loneliness, his failed relationships, and the emptiness he felt despite his success. Alma found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years, her words spilling out like a dam had broken. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing," she confessed, her voice trembling, "like I'm just there, not really living." Daniel reached for her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "You're not disappearing," he said firmly. "Not to me." The air between them grew charged, and Alma's resolve began to crumble. When Daniel leaned in to kiss her, she didn't pull away. For a moment, the guilt was overshadowed by the sheer relief of being wanted, of being alive. But as she left his house later that night, the weight of her actions settled heavily on her shoulders. She crept back into her own home, her heart pounding as she slipped into bed beside Roman, who slept soundly, oblivious to the storm raging within her. Hello there. Alma is having fun with his neighbor, while his police husband is on duty trying to provide for his family. If you think Alma deserves payback, subscribe. It helps a lot. Roman sat in his patrol car, the hum of the engine a constant backdrop to his thoughts. The streets were quiet, but his mind was anything but. He replayed the last few months in his head, trying to pinpoint when things had started to feel off. Alma had been distant, her smiles forced, her laughter rare. He had chalked it up to the stress of raising two young girls and managing the household, but now he wasn't so sure. He thought back to their early years, when their love had felt unshakable. Alma had been his rock, his constant. She had supported him through the academy, through the long hours and the dangers of his job. But lately, something had changed. She seemed disconnected, as if she were living in a world he couldn't access. Roman's thoughts turned to Daniel, their neighbor. He had always seemed friendly, but there was something about him that made Roman uneasy. Maybe it was the way Daniel looked at Alma, or the way he always seemed to be around when Roman wasn't. He shook off the feeling, attributing it to his cop instincts always being on high alert. As he drove through the quiet streets, Roman's thoughts drifted to his daughters. Mia and Lily were his pride and joy, the laughter a balm to his weary soul. He hated being away from them so much, but he had no choice. Providing for his family was his priority, even if it meant sacrificing time with them. When Roman finally returned home, the house was dark. He tiptoed upstairs, checking on the girls before slipping into bed beside Alma. She stirred but didn't wake, her breathing steady. Roman reached for her hand, his heart aching with a love he couldn't quite express. "I'm trying," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just hope it's enough." The next morning, Alma woke to the sound of Roman's alarm. She pretended to be asleep as he dressed and left for work, her mind already racing with plans for the day. The girls would be at school, and she would have hours to herself, hours she could spend with Daniel. But as she prepared breakfast, a wave of guilt washed over her. She looked at Mia and Lily, their innocent faces a stark reminder of the life she was risking. "Mommy, are you okay?" Mia asked, her small voice filled with concern. Alma forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." After dropping the girls off at school, Alma returned home, her heart heavy. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over Daniel's number. She knew she should end it, but the thought of losing the one thing that made her feel alive was unbearable. When Daniel texted her, asking to meet, Alma hesitated, but the pull was too strong. She found herself at his door, her guilt momentarily silenced by the promise of his touch. Their time together was a blur of whispered confessions and stolen moments. Daniel's house was a world away from her own, a place where she could forget her responsibilities and lose herself in the moment. But as their affair continued, the risks grew. Roman's schedule was unpredictable, and the fear of getting caught loomed over her like a dark cloud. One afternoon, as Alma and Daniel lay in bed, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sent them both into a panic. Alma's heart raced as she peered out the window, relief flooding her when she realized it wasn't Roman. But the close call was a wake-up call. "We need to be more careful," Alma whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel nodded, but his eyes held a glint of something darker. "Maybe it's time we stop hiding," he suggested, his tone casual but his words loaded. Alma's stomach churned. She wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she ever would be. As she returned home that evening, Alma's guilt weighed heavier than ever. She looked at her daughters, their laughter filling the house, and felt a pang of shame. She was risking everything, her marriage, her family, her life, for a fleeting moment of happiness. But as she lay in bed that night, the memory of Daniel's touch lingered, a reminder of the life she was desperate to hold on to. The affair between Alma and Daniel had become a dangerous dance, each meeting riskier than the last. Alma's guilt gnawed at her constantly, but the thrill of being seen, of being desired, was a drug she couldn't quit. Daniel's house was her escape, a place where she could shed the weight of her responsibilities and lose herself in the moment. But with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. One afternoon, as Alma and Daniel sat in his living room, the sound of a car door slamming outside sent them both into a panic. Alma's heart raced as she peered through the blinds, her breath catching in her throat when she saw Roman's patrol car parked in their driveway. "He's home early," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's expression darkened. "You need to go," he said, his tone urgent but calm. Alma nodded, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. She slipped out the back door, her heart pounding as she hurried across the yard and into her own home. Roman was in the kitchen, his back to her as he rummaged through the fridge. Alma forced a smile, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Hey, you're home early," she said, trying to sound casual. Roman turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, my shift ended early," he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "Where were you?" Alma's stomach churned, but she kept her composure. "Just out for a walk," she lied, her voice wavering ever so slightly. Roman nodded, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't entirely convinced. As the days passed, Alma's anxiety grew. Roman's questions became more pointed, his tone sharper. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of her lies becoming unbearable. But every time she thought about ending the affair, the thought of losing Daniel, of losing the one thing that made her feel alive, was too much to bear. Roman's unease grew with each passing day. Alma's behavior was increasingly erratic, her excuses flimsy. He began to notice the little things, the way she jumped when he entered a room, the way she avoided his gaze. His cop instincts kicked into overdrive, but he pushed the thoughts aside. He didn't want to believe it. One evening, Roman came home early, hoping to surprise Alma, but the house was empty. The girl's at a friend's house. He called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A knot formed in his stomach as he stepped outside, his eyes scanning the neighborhood. That's when he saw her, emerging from Daniel's house, her hair disheveled, her face flushed. Roman's heart shattered as the pieces fell into place. He turned away before she could see him, his mind racing with anger and betrayal. When Alma returned home, Roman was sitting at the kitchen table, his face a mask of pain and fury. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Alma froze, her mind scrambling for an excuse, but the look in Roman's eyes told her he already knew. "I can explain," she began, but Roman cut her off. "Explain what? That you've been cheating on me with our neighbor? How long, Alma? How long has this been going on?" His voice broke, the pain evident in every word. Alma's guilt overwhelmed her, and she broke down in tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt hollow. Roman stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "Sorry isn't enough," he said, his voice cold. "You've destroyed everything." The days that followed were a blur of anger, tears, and silence. Roman moved into the guest room, his presence a constant reminder of the rift between them. The girls sensed the tension, their innocent questions adding to Alma's guilt. One evening, Roman confronted Alma again, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "How could you do this to us? To our family?" he demanded, his eyes searching hers for answers she didn't have. Alma's tears flowed freely as she struggled to find the words. "I was lonely," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were always gone, and I just wanted to feel something." Roman's expression softened, but the pain in his eyes remained. "I know my job keeps me away, but that doesn't excuse what you did. We could have talked to Alma. We could have worked through this together." Alma nodded, her guilt overwhelming her. "I know," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Roman. I never meant to hurt you." Roman sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his emotions. "I don't know if we can fix this," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But for the sake of the girls, we have to try." Alma's heart ached as she looked at him, the man she had loved for so many years. "I want to try," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." As they sat in silence, the weight of their shared pain hung heavy in the air. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the sake of their family, they were willing to try. The days after the confrontation were a storm of silence and tension. Roman moved into the guest room, his presence a constant reminder of the chasm between them. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a prison of unspoken words and stifled emotions. Mia and Lily, sensing the shift, began to ask questions. "Why is Daddy sleeping in the other room?" Mia asked one evening, her small voice trembling with confusion. Alma knelt down, brushing a tear from her daughter's cheek. "Daddy just needs some space right now," she said, her voice breaking. "But we both love you very much, okay?" Roman, too, struggled with the fallout. He threw himself into his work, using the long hours and demanding cases as a distraction from the pain at home. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the image of Alma leaving Daniel's house. The betrayal etched into his mind like a scar. One night, after the girls were asleep, Roman found himself standing in the doorway of their shared bedroom. Alma was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. She looked up when she heard him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Roman," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He hesitated, his heart torn between anger and the love he still felt for her. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Alma nodded, her tears flowing freely. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, "but I want to try. For the girls. For us." Roman sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if that's enough," he said, his voice breaking, "but I'm willing to try. For them." Therapy became their lifeline. Every week, they sat in a small, dimly lit office, unpacking the pain and betrayal that had torn them apart. The sessions were grueling, each word a step toward healing, but also a reminder of the wounds they carried. "I felt invisible," Alma admitted during one session, her voice trembling. Roman was always gone, and when he was home, it felt like he wasn't really there. I wanted to feel seen." Roman listened, his jaw clenched as he fought back his own emotions. "I know my job takes me away," he said, his voice low. "But I never stopped loving you, Alma. I just didn't know how to show it." The therapist, a calm and patient woman named Dr. Ellis, guided them through the process. "Healing isn't about forgetting," she said. "It's about understanding and rebuilding. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard." Slowly, tentatively, Roman and Alma began to rebuild their connection. They started small, shared meals, conversations about their day, moments of laughter with the girls. It wasn't perfect, and the scars of betrayal still lingered, but they were trying. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Roman reached for Alma's hand. "I don't know if we'll ever be the same," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But maybe we can be something better." Alma squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I'll spend the rest of my life earning your trust," she whispered. "I promise." A year had passed since the affair came to light, and while the wounds were still tender, they had begun to heal. Roman and Alma celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, the girls giggling as they helped decorate the table with handmade cards and flowers. As they sat together, surrounded by the love of their daughters, Roman raised his glass. "To us," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "To the life we've built, the mistakes we've made, and the future we're still fighting for." Alma clinked her glass against his, her eyes shining with tears. "To us," she echoed, her voice trembling. "And to second chances." Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Roman and Alma sat on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around them like a blanket. They talked for hours about their dreams, their fears, and the life they still wanted to build together. "I'm not perfect," Alma said, her voice soft, "and I know I hurt you in ways I can never fully make up for. But I love you, Roman. I always have. Roman reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. I love you too, he said. And I'm not perfect either. But we're here. We're trying. And that's enough. As they sat together, watching the stars twinkle above, a sense of peace settled over them. The road ahead would still be challenging, but they were facing it together. Their love, though scarred, was stronger than ever.